Hello and welcome to the Daily Politics. It's the first day back at school for MPs after the election. But with a hung parliament, could things start to get a little unruly in the Westminster playground? The Prime Minister will welcome the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, Arlene Foster, to Downing Street shortly as she seeks a deal to enable the Conservatives to govern. So what will it mean? The leader of the Conservatives in Scotland, Ruth Davidson, says the party's approach to Brexit must change following the election. Is she right? Parliament has 93 new MPs, a good number of whom didn't expect to be turning up today. So what's it like taking a seat in Parliament for the first time? We meet some of the new intake. And it was a disappointing election night for UKIP, resulting in the resignation of their leader, Paul Nuttall. We speak to one of those seeking to replace him. All that in the next hour, and with us for the whole of the programme today is the former leader of the Conservative Party, Michael Howard. Welcome back to the Daily Politics.
Thank you, Jo.
First today, the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, Arlene Foster, is due at Downing Street in the next half hour or so for talks about supporting a Conservative minority government on key government business. Well, our reporter Eleanor Garnier is in a very sunny Downing Street. Eleanor, what deal are we expecting between the Conservatives and the Democratic Unionist Party?
Jo, this is going to be much more of a looser deal, if you like. It's not going to be a formal coalition like we saw between the Lib Dems and the Conservatives when they were in a coalition government. It's going to be a sort of confidence and supply arrangement where the DUP will agree to back the Conservatives on really big votes like the budget, like the Queen's speech. But after that, all the other issues will be more on a issue-by-issue, vote-by-vote, day-by-day basis. So it's going to be a much looser arrangement. And remember how much Theresa May needs this deal to be done. Without this majority that she will get from the support of the DUP, she will not be able to govern. So she really needs it. And as for Arlene Foster, the DUP leader, well, of course, she wants to go back home, showing that she's got something out of this deal. So an element of this will be a bit about a transaction, cash for votes, if you like, some sort of investment alongside it.
Yes, so there's a price on the one hand, no doubt, that Arlene Foster will want to extract from the Prime Minister. What about the issue of Brexit? Because the DUP have concerns about cross-border trade after Brexit.
Yeah, Brexit and the Brexit negotiations is certainly something the two leaders are going to be talking about in Number 10 in the next hour or so. And certainly the issue of that hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, that is something that the DUP do not want, but it's also something that Theresa May does not want. She's talked about having a frictionless border, and the DUP want it to be as flexible as possible. They do support Brexit, some of them enthusiastically so, but I think this idea of putting the economy first and having continued access to people, so skilled and unskilled workers, goods and services, that position from the DUP, it has given, I think, some of those in the Conservative Party who want the closest possible relationship with the EU, it has given them some hope. And we're expecting Arlene Foster to arrive, I think, in the next half an hour or so. We did hear from the Northern Ireland Secretary James Brokenshaw this morning. He was saying things are looking pretty positive and he expects a deal to be done.
Well, Eleanor Garnier, we will leave you to keep your eyes peeled on that black door for the arrival of Arlene Foster. Michael Howard, did you think your party would be in this position before election night?
No.
No. And how do you feel now you've woken up to the idea of a hung parliament?
I'm obviously disappointed. It was not the result that I'd hoped to see.
Was it all down to a disastrous campaign?
Well, it clearly wasn't a great campaign, but I think there's little to be gained by looking back. No doubt people can reflect at leisure on the lessons to be learned. I'm sure there are lessons to be learned. I'm much more interested in the present and the future.
Except
where we go from here.
There are lessons, though, to be learnt, aren't there, for the future, because the talks that are about to start between Theresa May and Arlene Foster, much of it will be about what price Arlene Foster wants to extract from Theresa May, including perhaps some of the austerity measures that she might feel should come out of any legislative programme that the Conservatives want to be put forward, like the social care policy, for example, or the winter fuel payments cut that was in the Tory manifesto. So were they mistakes in the campaign?
Well, let's talk about the present and the future and what Arlene Foster might want, and let's wait and see. You've just heard that there's every prospect of a deal being reached today between Arlene Foster and the Prime Minister. I hope a deal is reached, and we'll have to wait and see how that deal plays out. We've been here before. This is not the first time that there's been a government which hasn't had an overall majority, which has been operating in a hung parliament and which has had to do deals with minority parties.
Well, it's been quite a long time. The coalition was different. The coalition was different, of course.
The coalition was completely different. I'm old enough to remember the days of Prime Minister Callaghan and Prime Minister Wilson.
It was a long time ago, Michael Howard.
Yeah, well, I'm getting on, Joe.
I don't mean to say anything about your age. I mean, I only mean that this was the 1970s. That was the 1970s. In this case, you also remember from those days that they can pull the plug at any time, of course.
Oh, look, it's not an ideal situation. And as I said at the outset, it's not where I'd hoped we'd be.
Are you comfortable with a relationship, even a loose confidence and supply relationship between the Conservatives and the Democratic Unionist Party?
They've got 10 elected members of Parliament to the United Kingdom Parliament. They are legitimately elected members of Parliament, and if they're prepared to support us, yes.
Right. What about what they might want in return for supporting the Queen's Speech, the legislative programme, the budget, the big sort of what we would call financial or economic policies that a government has to get through Parliament in order to survive? What would you be prepared to give in terms of offering something to Arlene Foster?
Do you know, since I know perfectly well that I'm not going to be in that position, it is something to which I have not given any thought.
But there has to be support from her own Conservative Party, and there have to be some lines drawn. I mean, in terms of looking at things like deficit reduction, are you prepared to see quite a bit of money go over to the Democratic Unionist Party?
I am prepared to leave these things to the good judgment of the Prime Minister, and I'm sure that she will have the support of all Conservative members of Parliament on the deal that she, I hope, will do with Arlene Foster this afternoon.
So you think she can cling on, Theresa May?
Oh, not only do I think she should stay, or she could stay, I think she should stay. I think she has a duty and a responsibility to stay. I think it would be immensely disruptive to the Brexit negotiations, which are now only a few days away, if we had either a Conservative leadership contest or a general election while those negotiations are going on.
Well, except, of course, we've heard already from the EU negotiating team, Michel Barnier, that he does want a strong team from the UK that does have a mandate.
Well, there will be a strong team from the United Kingdom. He's not going to be negotiating with members of Parliament. He's not going to be negotiating with opposition parties. He's going to be negotiating with the Prime Minister and the Brexit Secretary of the United Kingdom. They're going to be the people sitting at the other side of the table from him.
But she is weakened, clearly, by the result. George Osborne, the former Chancellor, called her a dead man walking. You obviously don't want a leadership contest because you don't want to see Jeremy Corbyn have a chance of going to number 10, so you're prepared to stick with her just because there isn't a better idea or option on the table?
No, I want her to stay because I think any kind of contest or general election would be immensely disruptive to the Brexit negotiations. So I think every Conservative member of Parliament should give her strong and full support, and the signs are from last night's meeting of the 1922 committee that that's exactly what's going to happen.
Now, it's time for our daily quiz, and there's always plenty of political drama to keep us entertained here in Westminster. But word reaches that a new political drama will be coming to our screens this weekend. So the question for today is, which of these is the odd one out? Is it A, Will Barton as Boris Johnson, B, Jacqueline King as Theresa May, C, Meryl Streep as Margaret Thatcher, or D, John Seward as Michael Gove? And at the end of the show, this Michael in the studio will give us the correct answer, or will give us an answer anyway. Now, when Theresa May called the election, she said she needed a majority to be able to deliver Brexit and overcome division in Westminster. As it was, she ended up losing that majority and will now have to rely on the DUP for support. But does this mean the government's approach to Brexit will have to change? Back in February, the government produced a white paper on the Brexit plans, which included 12 principles for the negotiation, with the focus on controlling immigration and leaving the single market, as well as leaving the customs union to strike free trade deals with the rest of the world. Although a free trade deal with the EU was promised, Theresa May's view that no deal is better than a bad deal was also reflected in the Conservative manifesto, along with the continued commitment to reduce net migration to the tens of thousands. But after failing to win a majority and the need to come to a deal with the DUP, some have suggested the emphasis may have to shift. DUP leader Arlene Foster has spoken out against leaving the EU without a trade deal in place and has raised the issue of maintaining the open border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Last week's election result has also led to many within the Conservative Party calling for a changed stance on Brexit, led by Scottish Conservative leader Ruth Davidson, who has called for an open Brexit, which prioritises free trade over curbing migration. Labour, meanwhile, is also committed to leave the single market to curbing free movement, something that Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell reiterated at the weekend. Prominent Conservative Leave campaigners insist all this means the party's approach to Brexit won't change.
The party overall is settled. What we want, obviously, is to engage and discuss these matters with people, but in essence, those negotiations are due to start very, very shortly, i.e. next week, and the Conservative government needs to get on and make sure that they now start talking to our European allies and friends about how we arrange to have the benefits. As the Labour Party stood on the same manifesto, they stood on a manifesto which said no to the single market, no to customs union, control of our borders. So the majority of the British people had in front of them two parties that constituted the majority of the votes that actually stood on very similar manifestos on Brexit.
That was Ian Duncan-Smith. Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined by the Conservative MP and former Attorney General Dominic Grieve. Welcome back to the Daily Politics. Have the fundamentals of the Brexit negotiating position changed following the election?
The change that's taken place is firstly that the government doesn't currently have a majority, although we may succeed in doing that with the DUP. And the second change is, I think, we need to listen to the message which the electorate is giving to us. One of the messages I pick up from the electorate at this election was that they are increasingly concerned about the economic well-being of the country, that they are fed up with austerity, partly because austerity was a means to an end and they see this as a permanent state. And it's not surprising in those circumstances they should be troubled by it. And I think there's also an appreciation, which is something which I've been saying for a long time, that Brexit may have opportunities, but it also carries risks.
So you agree, you don't agree with Ian Duncan-Smith that the issue is now settled?
I've never thought the issue was settled. I didn't think the issue was settled before the election, because my view has always been that firstly you have to negotiate and you have to see what you can get from the negotiation. Secondly, you have to be realistic about what is in the national interest at any given moment against a moving background. The background is undoubtedly a moving one. The question is, what is in the best interests of the country? If we spend years mired in Brexit negotiations, which are damaging to the economy in the short to medium term, whatever the opportunities may be in the longer term, then I'm not sure that the electorate are going to thank us for that.
Right,
and I think that they are looking for trying to bring this matter to as clean and rapid a conclusion as possible.
Right, but what does it mean in practical terms? Does the government's negotiating position need to change? Or is it still in your mind the case that they will continue down the path of saying Britain is leaving the single market and leaving the customs union?
The government's entitled to explore the options in negotiation that may be on offer. But in doing that, I think the government needs to be realistic both about its own ability to command a majority in the House, and secondly, it needs to be realistic about the national interest in terms of getting this matter resolved. Provided we keep those two things in mind and adopt a common sense approach and eschew ideology, we will probably come out with the right conclusion.
So all options are on the table?
Yes, they should be.
Right, Michael Howard. I mean, it's true, you didn't win the election. Labour didn't win the election. And despite the fact that in both those manifestos, it clearly said we are committed to leaving the single market and we are committed to leaving the customs union, everything's changed.
Well, one thing hasn't changed, and surprisingly enough, Dominic didn't actually mention it, and that is that just about a year ago, we had a referendum. And that referendum resulted in a clear vote by the people of this country in favour of leaving the European Union. Now, of course, I'm totally in agreement with Dominic that we need a common sense approach. I absolutely agree that we must keep the national interest in mind at all times. But as Ian Duncan-Smith has reminded us, the truth is that I heard Jeremy Corbyn say very clearly on Sunday morning we must leave the single market. That's the government's position. He said we must try and get a tariff-free agreement of access to the single market. That's the government's position. The Labour manifesto said leaving the European Union means the end of free movement. That's the government's position. So actually there is, as Ian said, an enormous degree of consensus between the two main parties for those objectives. And the only parties that were really seeking to undo Brexit in the general election were the SNP, which substantially lost ground, and the Liberal Democrats, which failed to gain any ground.
Right, Dominic Grieve. So the principles set out in the White Paper are still the principles that the government is going to negotiate on?
I was very happy to endorse the principles set out in the White Paper and the Lancaster House speech. Indeed, if the Prime Minister could achieve those objectives, I've said before, I think people would recognise it was a remarkable outcome. So I don't disagree, and I certainly don't disagree with the question of calling into question the democratically expressed will of a majority of the electorate we should leave the EU.
But if we don't leave the single market, would you accept, and we are still then subject to the four freedoms, as they are called by the European Union, including freedom of movement of people, would we be leaving the EU?
Yes, we would. Of course we would be leaving the EU, but it's a different way of leaving the EU, and it's a legitimate subject of debate as to whether the national interest should take one route or another. But both are leaving the EU, certainly in terms of the question that was put to the electorate last year. So both, in my view, are capable and should be capable of being debated. But that's not to say that the Prime Minister's approach as set out in the Lancaster House speech was wrong. Right.
I mean, do you accept that is another version of Brexit? And actually, as you know, there has been a lot of debate within your own party, as well as the other parties, including Labour, that actually what people voted for in that referendum was, yes, to leave the EU, take back control and sovereignty, but not to necessarily leave the single market.
Well, if we remain subject to freedom of movement, one of the four freedoms you mentioned, and if we remain subject to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, we will not have taken back control. People will not have got what they voted for a year ago, and we will not in any real sense have left the European Union.
But even Ruth Davidson, who's the leader of the Tories in Scotland, as you know, and has increased the number of MPs, Tory MPs in Scotland, and now has a certain amount of influence that she can bring to bear to the negotiation. And she is calling very strongly, saying we need to look again at the Brexit strategy. And she's also saying it's not just a Tory Brexit, need to include all the parties. There needs to be much more consensus. Is she right?
Well, it depends what she means, and she's called for an open Brexit. I'm afraid I have absolutely no idea what an open Brexit
She doesn't want immigration to be at the forefront. Is she right in that regard, that actually the economy should come before a commitment to tens of thousands in terms of net migration?
Well, I don't believe the commitments to tens of thousands is going to form part of the negotiation. When we were in the Brexit campaign, I used to say, and I meant, that the Brexit campaign was not about lowering immigration. It was about who decides what our level of immigration should be. And taking back control means that we should have the right to decide in this country for ourselves who we need to come into the country and who they should be.
Is this a Remain fight back? Is this an attempt by Remainers across the House of Commons to say we don't want to leave the single market, and we are being buoyed by the fact that there's been this snap poll of 700 members of the Institute of Directors that's found a dramatic drop in confidence following the hung Parliament, and they're worried about access to skilled labour? Does that not bring more pressure to bear for that view?
Certainly we should listen to what the business community is saying. The Conservative Party has usually built its reputation on quiet government and sound economic management. If we are not delivering those two things, then we shouldn't be surprised when people get attracted to other visions. And we have to face up to the fact that Brexit was, in its own way, a revolutionary act. And the trouble with revolutions is they tend to breed further revolutionary acts as a consequence. And those of us who have responsibility to ensure good governance have to keep that in mind when we're trying to find the right way forward to respond properly to the message that the electorate's giving us, and at the same time to ensure that we have the sort of quiet, good government which makes people confident about their future and ultimately prevents this country from lurching around from one crisis to another.
Right. Do you agree with that vision?
Of course, we have to do all those things while also complying with the instruction given to us by the British people a year ago to leave the European Union.
Right, but of course, as we're listening to Dominic Grieve, he's saying we are going to have to broaden the options on the table. I mean, do you see these calls for, and it is a loaded term, a softening of Brexit? Does that worry you? Does that make you think that actually maybe Brexit's just not going to happen?
I have no idea what these phrases mean. I don't know what is meant by a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit or an open Brexit. What I think it's more useful to concentrate on are the substantive issues, which, to be fair, we've just been discussing. Do we leave the single market? Do we retain control over freedom of movement? Do we continue to subject ourselves to the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice? Those are the issues that really matter. And they're going to be resolved one way or another in the negotiations. But
you can understand people's concerns when they hear that the NHS was one of the headlines facing a staffing crisis after Brexit because it sparked a jaw-dropping 96% fall in EU nurses applying for jobs. I mean, that would make people think, I want to rethink that decision to leave the single market.
Well, I think people are drawing the wrong conclusions from the likely outcome of the Brexit negotiations.
But it's already happening. The applications are falling, so they're taking that message away.
But when we leave, we will have control over our immigration policy. If it's the case, as it's quite likely to be, that we need people to come into the country to help nursing people in the NHS, we will be able to frame an immigration policy accordingly.
Right, but it's already putting people off. That's the evidence from some of these surveys. Do you now see an option, a clear path for a much longer transition, a much longer transitional period that could take several years and would keep Britain under EU single market terms?
Look, I think it is ludicrously premature to talk about a transition when we don't know what the outcome of the negotiation is going to be.
But that will be part of the negotiation, won't it?
Well, it may be. I've no doctrinal objection to a transitional period, but that is something that you decide on when you've completed the negotiations, you've decided what needs to happen, and then you can make a sensible decision about how long that's going to take. And if that involves a transitional arrangement or an implementation period, I would have no doctrinal difficulty with that, but it's not something to be decided now.
Right. We're going to talk briefly about austerity, which you mentioned at the beginning. Before we do, I mean, there does seem to be a certain amount of turmoil within the DexU department. That is the department that is in charge of Britain leaving the EU. David Jones has been sacked. George Bridges, Minister in the Lords, has quit government. James Chapman, the head of communications, has left. It's not really going to inspire confidence, is it, in the negotiations?
Well, David Davis is still there.
Yes.
But
he seems to have lost the whole team of people.
But our position has been laid out, as Dominic reminded us, both in the White Paper and in the Lancaster House speech. So our opening position has been laid out very clearly, and I can't see any reason why negotiations shouldn't start next week. And I think we all hope that they reach a rapid, speedy conclusion, which is good for both of us. The European Union don't want the United Kingdom to become an impoverished country. They want us to prosper, and we want them to prosper. And it's in our mutual interest that we reach a sensible, constructive agreement.
Well, look, that's Brexit for the moment. Let's talk a little bit about austerity, because Theresa May's new Chief of Staff, Gavin Barwell, told Panorama that anger over Brexit and austerity caused the Conservative Party to lose seats, including his own. Let's have a listen.
There's a conversation I particularly remember with a teacher who had voted for me in 2010 and in 2015 and said, I understood the need for a pay freeze for a few years to deal with the deficit, but you're now asking that to go on potentially for 10 or 11 years, and that's too much. That is something that Jeremy Corbyn was able to tap into.
Now, just to make clear, Gavin Barwell was recorded for that programme before he was made Theresa May's new Chief of Staff. Do you agree with him?
Yes, I do. I think it was quite clear that austerity was a necessity born of the 2008 financial crisis. It's why the coalition was set up, and actually it's also why we were re-elected in 2015. There was an appreciation that our financial management was actually, made mistakes, but was pretty good, and the economy was recovering. The difficulty we now have is that the events of last year create instability and anxiety about the future. And if that becomes a state of permanence, people then start asking, I'm quite prepared to make sacrifices if I think it's leading to an outcome which is going to be good for me and my family. But if it becomes a state of semi-permanence and you can't show the direction of travel in which you're going, then it's going to become much harder to persuade people of that.
So is austerity over?
Well, I think we need to be realistic. Before we suddenly start chucking billions of pounds at public services, we have also to look at what the consequences of doing that might be. I mean, if Jeremy Corbyn had won this election, this country would be on the road to economic ruin very, very quickly.
You might say that.
Well, I say
you
it,
might
and,
say
and
that.
I'm absolutely convinced of
right,
it. So,
except, Dominic Grieve, well, that does surprise me. The thing is, though, you are going to do exactly, partly, I'm not saying wholesale, partly what Jeremy Corbyn was suggesting in his manifesto. You are going to reverse austerity.
Well, I don't know what the Prime Minister and the Chancellor...
But you just said it would be the right thing to do.
What the Prime Minister and the Chancellor need to do, and I think they recognise this, is that one has to understand the extent to which the austerity that has been seen as a necessity...
And gone on too long.
Whether it's gone on too long is another matter. The question is, has the limits of reasonableness been reached with the electorate? And
right.
I think that we have to recognise, but this is going to be a very big challenge, because if as a result of turning the tap on of public expenditure, we start to undermine wealth creation in this country, in the long term we will leave an even worse legacy. And this has always been the conundrum for all respectable governments.
Right. Well,
Jeremy Corbyn didn't offer respectable government. It's a fantasy vision he
did quite well, though, didn't he? And
yes,
a lot better than you expected.
But that's the danger. If respectable government cannot offer a credible vision, the fantasists will soon creep into the picture.
Well, except your vision was not accepted either by a majority of people in terms of seats. So do you agree this was a protest about ongoing austerity hitting those who are less well off?
Well, it's entirely understandable, as Dominic has said, and as Gavin Barwell has said, that people should be increasingly frustrated by austerity. We all completely understand that.
So why did you keep offering it in the manifesto?
Because on the other hand, as a country, we have to try to get to a situation in which we are living within our means. We're not living within our means at the moment. We haven't been living within our means for quite a long time. And at some point, we have to try and get back to that situation.
Except
now,
it's the priorities that were wrong. It was the priorities that were wrong, maybe, in the manifesto.
Balancing that objective with responding to the understandable desire of the electorate for something different is going to be one of the great challenges facing the government.
Would you be in favour of the public sector pay freeze ending?
I'm not the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
No, I know that.
I don't want to. I don't want to second guess or first guess. No, I don't want to second guess or first guess the Chancellor of the Exchequer on that. It's one of the challenges he faces, and I wish him the best of fortune.
I'm sure you do.
As he addresses it.
All right, Dominic Grieve, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Now, 93 newly elected MPs are polishing their shoes, dusting down their best suits and getting ready for their first day in the House of Commons. And our Ellie has been finding out how they're feeling.
If you thought Thursday night's result was a surprise, spare a thought for those candidates who hadn't expected it either. And now they've got new jobs, starting today. One of the Tories' newest, youngest and surprisedest didn't even have a suit.
I had to go and buy one today. I genuinely didn't own one. I had one, an old Primark one that's been through about 10 weddings. So I've been splashed out of Matalan today. Very nice, upmarket.
And I don't believe he'll come back.
Also not turning up in a suit yet, a new Labour MP who used to work at Parcel Force. He wore his old work shirt down to Westminster. Hi, how are you?
Very nice to meet you.
Nice to see you. First day jitters?
No, not jitters. It kind of reminds me of my first day on the Labour ward.
No, not that kind of Labour. He's a doctor.
I knew a little bit about what I was doing, trying to help mothers to deliver their babies safely, but I didn't really have very much experience and I had a lot to learn. The good thing is that the midwives and the other doctors there were very helpful, and I'm hoping for a bit of that today.
So do you even know where the toilets are and the coffee shop and that sort of thing?
Not yet, but I'm sure I'll find it.
I'm sure you will. See you soon. Bye, good luck. Other newbies have had to have awkward conversations with their bosses.
I said, look, I'm running for this because I care about it, it's important to me, but don't worry, I'll be back on Monday the 12th. And they were like, OK, off you go. And then I won.
They're also getting the hang of how to introduce themselves.
I'm Vera Hobhouse, I'm the Liberal Democrat MP for Bath. Hang on, oh no, I'm the MP for Bath.
Others aren't so new. They just had a break for 7 years, like David Drew, who lost his seat in 2010 and found it again this time.
It's all very different. I mean, there are things like you get your laptop and your iPad. I've never had that before, so there are some good things. But the downside is you're still going to have to wait 4 to 6 weeks for an office, so nothing changes completely.
So far, it's been all about photo calls for the new MPs. The work gets underway in Westminster this afternoon with the election of the Speaker, and then they'll get sworn in over the coming days.
Ellie Price reporting, and I'm joined here by 2 more new members of Parliament. Emma Dent-Coad won the seat of Kensington for the Labour Party, and Christine Jardine won Edinburgh West for the Liberal Democrats. Congratulations to both of you. I hope I'm not being impolite by saying you must have been slightly surprised to have won the Labour stronghold of Kensington.
Not at all, actually, because I'm born and bred there, and knowing all the different communities there, not only there are a lot of people who had never been represented, not by the previous Conservative MPs, not at all, feeling completely alienated from the process and suddenly have become engaged. And that was a huge issue. I mean, we haven't had the ward returns yet. It would be very interesting. But a lot of Conservatives who are appalled by the inequalities, not only Brexit issues, but the inequalities in Kensington, also voted for me, and they've been emailing me for the last few days asking me to go and talk to them.
What about your experience on the night? What was it like?
Tense, waiting for the phone call. The first surprise was when the BBC exit poll said it was going to be a hung parliament.
Did you think then, oh, there might be hope for me?
No, I have to be honest and say that we were quite confident going into the night. We weren't taking it for granted, but we'd had very good returns, very good feeling on the door, and we knew it was going to be close, but we were confident that we could do it.
Now, there were a lot of close results on the night. I mean, we had Stephen Gethins on yesterday. The SNP held a seat with 2 votes and had numerous recounts. That will have been a long night and day. How many recounts were there in Kensington?
We had 3. They're all completely exhausted. I felt so sorry for the counters. We could at least run out and have a bit of a rest, but they were totally exhausted. I think there were some press pictures of them, and then they had to go to work the next day. So that was rather unfair. But we had 3, and it wasn't tenterhooks. And 20 is still a pretty decent amount in Kensington. I think that's pretty decent. We're all delighted.
What about the moment when they announced the numbers and you realised you had got it?
That is pretty special. And when they take you into the candidates' briefing room to tell you, by that time you suspect, because everybody's been tallying the votes, they know what happens, but you don't know what the actual numbers are going to be. And that is pretty special. And it's exciting. It's exciting for all the people around about you who've worked very hard for months and years to make it happen. And it's their work and it's their moment as much, sometimes more than it is yours, because they're the ones who've actually delivered the victory.
What were the issues, do you think, that won it for you?
Oh, independence.
So that was right across the board, of course, in Scotland. It was felt by opponents to the SNP that was obviously for, and it was for you too.
Yes, we had local issues in Edinburgh West, but the impatience in Scotland with the SNP obsession with another independence referendum and keeping the ball rolling it's worn very, very thin. Even I think with some SNP supporters, they would much rather they got on with governing Scotland, and we were getting that everywhere.
Right, let's talk about the first day. So how's it feel? Are you nervous?
Not at all. It feels quite natural, actually.
Does it?
Yes, it does. I feel bizarrely calm. Which is lovely.
And what happens on the first day?
Well, you get lots of inductions. I've been a councillor for a long time, so it's not unlike that. So it's more or less what I expected, and very, very busy and learning lots of new things.
And have you been shown round? Are you finding your feet? Have you got an office?
Not yet. I have actually worked here before. I worked for a spell in the Coalition. So I knew my way around the estate, but you see it very differently when you can now go in the members-only areas. But I think you have to remember, not get too carried away, and remember it's only part of the job. There's another big part back in your constituency, and being here is only part of it.
Yes, and that's something obviously you've got to strike a balance between, and you've got some way to travel. You are a little bit closer in that regard. You've put your PhD on hold, I understand.
I have, for the moment.
What were you doing?
I've got to negotiate. Architecture, politics and ideology under Franco in Spain. I'm half Spanish.
Oh, goodness, right, I see. So that's on hold.
We're just going to park it for a little while. I have to negotiate with my university, but I will be getting back to that at some point.
That indicates you weren't quite expecting to win perhaps on the night then.
Well, we had a plan in place.
And you used to work as a broadcaster?
Yeah, I worked for the BBC.
Right, so what's it like being on the other side?
You get used to it. I've had a few years now to adjust to being on the other side. But it is funny, particularly in Scotland. If I'm in Good Morning Scotland, I'm quite often being interviewed by the person who used to be my producer, and the producer is someone who was a researcher.
It's a small world.
We all juggle round, yeah.
Can you remember your first day, Michael?
Well, allow me first to congratulate both of you,
you.
On your victories. It's a huge privilege. Walking through the gate is just the most tremendous privilege and the tremendous feeling, and I do remember it. Actually, I had agreed with Sandra to go on breakfast television on the Friday morning, immediately after the
that was brave.
With Tim Brinton, who you will remember, and Jan, his wife, and so the four of us were there, and he was sort of giving me advice and showing me the ropes on television before I actually got to the palace.
And since then, all these years in Parliament, you haven't regretted a moment of it?
Well, I'm sure there are things that I regret, but...
What about advice for the two ladies?
It is an enormous privilege to be a Member of Parliament, and that sense of privilege will never leave you, I don't think. And it's a privilege that has to be earned and re-earned. Because
it isn't a job. Well, it isn't a job for life unless you have such a safe seat. I mean,
it's not only is it not a job for life, it is not something you should ever take for granted.
And the hung Parliament. I mean, did you expect that?
We thought it would be close, but who knows? No, I don't think so. I don't think anybody expected that, did they? I don't think the world expected that. But it was much better than some of us feared. But it's always possible. I mean, if we can turn Kensington red, we can do anything.
That may be true. What about some of the issues that you'll be pursuing? Obviously, yes, the independence referendum was an issue during the campaign, but now you're an MP.
Brexit's obviously going to be hugely important, because it was very important in Scotland as well, because Edinburgh, for example, the majority of people in Edinburgh West voted to stay in the UK and to stay in the European Union. And what we have to do now is ensure we get the best possible deal. Hopefully, Mrs May will see that the election result means that perhaps she didn't quite have the mandate she thought for a hard Brexit, and that's going to be something that I think the parties are all going to be pursuing.
So could you see yourselves working with Ruth Davidson in Scotland in terms of pursuing a similar approach to Brexit?
I don't know. I think we have to wait and see what happens. We have a very specific pro-EU approach. Ruth certainly, before the referendum, Ruth was very pro-Remain, so we'll just have to wait and see what happens in the next few days.
Right, well, good luck to both of you. Enjoy. And no doubt we'll see you
Thank
again
you.
soon. Come back on.
Thank you.
So there are a couple of constitutional fixes or conventions that might help Theresa May's government be a little bit more strong and stable. Among them is The Power of Evil, not a cheap Hollywood horror flick, but the relatively new concept of English votes for English laws, designed to stop MPs from Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland helping to impose laws on England. The other is the much older Salisbury Convention, created to protect a government's democratically supported manifesto being blocked by unelected peers. If that isn't all clear yet, don't worry, we have an expert, Dr. Alan Rennick from the Constitution Unit, who is in Oxford. Alan Rennick, welcome to the programme.
Thank you.
Can we... Oh, I'm just going to pause you there. I'm so sorry having introduced you, because we can just see pictures of Arlene Foster, the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, checking her watch. She's only a few minutes late. I think she was expected at 12:30, going in with Nigel Dodds there into number 10. And obviously her support is absolutely critical to Theresa May, so that she can actually govern. First of all, she's got to get her Queen's speech through Parliament, Theresa May. So this talks will be crucial. It's a lifeline, if you like, to Theresa May. comes, of course, after the Prime Minister apologised to her MPs for the election result, telling them, "I got us into this mess and I will get us out of it." We will return if that meeting finishes, but let's go back to Alan Rennick. Sorry for interrupting before you'd even begun there. So tell us about these constitutional fixes, first of all, on evil. Will the government be able to push through legislation relying only on English MPs?
No, is the simple answer. So, sorry, my earpiece has just popped out. So
they're very unreliable. Don't worry, you can hold on to it.
I shall hold on to it.
Yes, do.
So evil is very unlikely to make any difference at all, actually. The provision has introduced an extra element into the legislative process without changing any of the existing parts. So that means that matters that affect only England can be vetoed by English MPs. So there is a step in the process where English MPs have to agree to those laws, but those laws are still subject to a vote by the whole of the House of Commons. Although it is the case that Theresa May does have a majority, quite a comfortable majority of 60 MPs in England, that doesn't help her terribly much because she's still going to have to get anything through the whole of the Commons as well.
Right, so just to be clear, if she's got an issue, for instance, like expanding grammar schools, for example, expanding grammar schools in England because education is devolved, she would still have to get that past the whole House, in that sense, before she can go to English-only MPs, and, as we know, she doesn't have a majority for everything. The deal with the DUP will be on key issues. So she will still have the same problems as with any other legislation.
Yes, absolutely. And what the English Votes for English Laws provision does is, if there were a government that were the other way around, so if, say, the Labour Party had won 15 or so more seats and it were the party that were leading a minority government or a coalition government with a small number of MPs, then it would have been constrained by the English Votes and English Laws provision because it would not then have a majority in England.
Right.
So at that point, this provision would have been important.
All right.
But for this government, it doesn't really make any difference.
Let's talk about the Salisbury Convention and the House of Lords. The convention that if something is in the manifesto and obviously a government wins a majority, then the House of Lords should abide by that manifesto commitment. So if we look at something like restricting winter fuel payments for pensioners, it's in the manifesto, but of course Mrs May didn't get that majority. Can she still push it through the House of Lords using the Salisbury Convention?
Well, the Salisbury Convention is only a convention, so members of the House of Lords are not bound by it, and there are different views within the House of Lords as to what the convention means. So some would say that the convention does apply even when the government does not have a majority in the House of Commons. Others take the view that in that circumstance it shouldn't be regarded as applying, that the Salisbury Convention was introduced in 1945 when the Labour Party had a very large majority in the Commons but was well behind, didn't have many members of the House of Lords at all. And at that point, the leader of the House of Lords, Lord Salisbury, said that we recognise the mandate of the Labour government and we should respect that. But it's not clear, really, whether the House of Lords should see itself as being bound by the mandate of the current government because, as we know, the government doesn't have a majority of MPs.
Right. Alan Rennick, thank you very much. Michael Howard, problems ahead in the House of Lords. I mean, it is a convention and they don't necessarily have to abide by it, and the Tories do not have a majority in the House of Lords. When it comes to the plans for Brexit, for example, that no deal is better than a bad deal, you could find that that all goes in the House of Lords.
Well, you're looking many years ahead now, Jo, and we will cross that bridge if and when we ever reach it. I hope the Salisbury Convention will be respected. The Conservative Party got 44% of the votes, many more seats than Labour.
But they didn't win. I mean, why should it be?
Well, it depends what you mean by win. They didn't get an overall majority, but Labour did. No other party won.
No, but the Salisbury Convention usually applies when you get an overall majority.
Well, it's a convention, and I think it ought to apply in these circumstances. We should see.
Right, but, you know, when the Prime Minister has got her Queen's speech through the Commons, it might be difficult. You can see problems ahead if certain parts of that are held up by the House of Lords.
Well, of course, there may be all sorts of difficulties ahead. I hope the House of Lords will respect the primacy of the House of Commons, for a start. And then that is reinforced by the Salisbury Convention, which, as I've said, I think should apply.
Right. I mean, in Brexit, though, when we're looking ahead to the Great Repeal Bill, for example, there are already people saying that they won't support the Great Repeal Bill as the next substantial vote when it comes to Brexit.
Well, let's see what the Great Repeal Bill contains. I hope that everyone will look at it and vote on its merits. And as I say, we'll cross those bridges if and when we come to them.
We talked earlier about parts of the manifesto that will possibly have to be junked. Do you see that there will be parts of that manifesto that was fought on in this campaign that will have to go?
Well, the Queen's speech is going to result from discussions between the government and the DUP. And so, obviously, if there are things in the Queen's in the manifesto which the DUP is not prepared to support, it's not terribly likely that they'll find their way into the Queen's speech. But that's going to be the subject of the discussions, which are probably taking place as we speak, Jo.
Yes, they are indeed. I don't know how long they'll be in there while they are negotiating. Briefly back on evil English votes for English laws. I mean, that now is effectively a veto, isn't it? It's not going to help Theresa May at all in terms of pushing through English-only laws.
For the reasons given by your expert commentator, it's unlikely to have a very significant effect in this Parliament, I agree.
Briefly on the Fixed Term Parliaments Act. I mean, that is on the statute. Do you think that makes a 5-year term for Mrs May more likely?
It makes a 5-year term a little bit more likely, yes, because, as you know, there are provisions which have to be satisfied in order for an election to take place within that 5 years. However, those conventions didn't seem to be much of a bar to the calling of an election just a few weeks ago. And I suspect they won't be much of a bar to the calling of an election within the 5-year period, if that's what people want.
Do you think it should be scrapped? I mean, that was in the Conservative manifesto.
I think the fixed 5-year Parliament was absolutely necessary for the coalition, because you had to have provision which stopped one party cutting and running when it thought it would be to its electoral advantage. I'm much less convinced that it's necessary as a permanent feature of our constitution.
Right, so you wouldn't be unhappy if it went?
No.
One of the first things that our new MPs have to do is elect their Speaker. That post was held in the last Parliament by John Bercow. And he had been expected to face a challenge after increasing criticism from Tory MPs. But with a hung Parliament, one of the Speaker's most vocal detractors, Conservative MP James Duddridge, said there is not an appetite to push it to a vote, adding that there are more important battles to fight. You may be right. Well, I'm joined now by Bobby Freedman, who has written a biography of Speaker Bercow. Welcome back to the Daily Politics. So, when we're talking about winners and losers in this election, John Bercow, it seems, is a winner.
He is. He's a bit Teflon. He's been extremely lucky because over the period since 2009, he's needed all the cards to fall in the right place for him to stay as Speaker. And it's happened again because, as James Duddridge said today, there simply isn't the appetite or the ability to do it at the moment because obviously the Conservative Party have got more pressing issues.
But that does imply that there was quite a lot of opposition to him. I mean, tell us a little bit about some of the criticism of John Bercow.
Well, there's always been a huge amount of opposition to him, particularly within the Conservative Party. When he was elected in 2009, it was because Labour still had a majority at that time, and they voted for the Conservative MP that they knew David Cameron liked the least, and so that was why they did it. David Cameron, you know, he's always hated John Bercow, but never quite had the votes or the political will to get it through. And then, of course, just when it looked like Theresa May might have that big majority that might allow the Conservatives to finally get rid of him. And, of course, this is particularly important because Bercow, during the campaign, has said he's going to stay in for a full term, having pledged to only stay for 9 years. Then this opportunity is gone as well.
Right, but there was an attempt, wasn't there, to unseat him from the Speaker's throne just before 2015, and it failed, didn't it?
It did. There was that attempt. There was also an attempt more recently this year where there was a motion going round which didn't get get that many signatures. And again, it's because there hasn't ever been quite that majority. John Bercow, in fairness to him, does have support from a number of Conservative MPs. And obviously, as the years go on, that kind of visceral hatred of him that we had in 2009, that's lessened a bit. And, you know, many people think that he has been a fairly reasonable speaker. So the longer it goes on, and without that big Conservative majority, he's not going to get unseated because he has support on the other side of the House.
Do you like him, Michael?
It would be foolhardy in the extreme for a member of the House of Lords to express a view on the speakership of the House of Commons, and you wouldn't expect me to trespass on something which is totally,
I'm very disappointed.
Totally within the sovereignty
But that makes
of
it
the
sound
House
like he
of
doesn't
Commons.
like him.
Can I help answer that?
Yes.
One? Because this is an example of why John Bercow is so popular. Because, for example, when Michael Howard was leader of the Conservative Party, two might have got on, I think, John Bercow went to Lord Howard and said that he thought that Anne Widdecombe was right when she said there was something of the night about him. And that was the party leader at the time.
Ah. Maybe that's why you're not very keen to talk about it. Would you be pleased to see another term for Mr Bercow?
I respect the differences between the House of Lords and the House of Commons. And it certainly wouldn't be right for me to make any opinion.
I think you should break with convention for once. I mean, backbenchers are probably going to be even more empowered in this new Parliament. It's a hung Parliament, and he has got a reputation, John Bercow, rightly or wrongly, of trying to give more time to backbench MPs, hasn't he?
That's right. He's always said he's the backbencher speaker, and in fairness, he has been much better at holding the government to account in some ways. Whether that's because he hasn't liked the Conservative Prime Ministers, that's a moot point. But ultimately, yes, he does get backbenchers more involved. And I think as we see this Parliament, where obviously parliamentarians are really going to have their say, I think John Bercow will obviously allow that.
Do you think that has been a good thing, empowering Parliament to stand up to the executive, giving them more time, backbench MPs in, PMQs, which does now overrun? Has that been a positive?
Yes.
You do, and it should continue?
I'm sure it will.
Yes, I suppose it's easy when you're not the leader of the party anymore to say that. I mean, if Tory MPs are moaning less about him, do you think then that's gone, any attempt to get rid of him in the future?
I think, yes, for the next Parliament, assuming he doesn't want to try and stay on again for another Parliament after this. I mean, there just aren't those votes there. And when you're trying to hold a government together, as Theresa May is going to have to do, she just won't have that political capital to be able to do it. So I think, he has been very lucky, but I think he is safe for the next 5 years.
What about relations between him and Andrea Leadsom, who is now the new leader of the House, taking over from David Lidington? How do you see that relationship going?
Well, I mean, John Bercow has a real habit of falling out with people he has to deal with, so I wouldn't rule that out. But, at the moment, things are probably a little bit better than they have been. As I say, David Cameron really disliked him. Theresa May sort of tolerates him and gave quite a nice part for one of his leaflets in the run-up to the election endorsing him. So, he's getting on OK with the current leadership of the Conservative Party, and I think inevitably it'll be a bit rocky. But given where the majority stands at the moment, I think Andrea Leadsom will ultimately have to work with John Bercow.
Right. I mean, the other thing is, in a hung Parliament, I suppose his role becomes even more important. He has better relations, you say, with Theresa May. Is he going to mind his P's and Q's, I should say, in the future, or just carry on as if nothing has changed?
I don't think he's ever minded his P's and Q's, no. So I don't think we're going to see that starting now. I think he will just carry on as before. And, he is into his last 5 years, or so he says. So I think we may see him get even more demob happy, speaking out more on issues, not staying as impartial as he did over the EU referendum. So I think we'll see him sort of trespassing into other areas as he started to do earlier this year.
Right, so you think he could actually cause a little more trouble then in the future?
Yes, just dripping a little bit of poison now and again.
Right. What advice would you give to John Bercow? I'm not asking you to say whether you like him or not, but what advice would you say in this hung Parliament, in his position now as arbiter of a hung Parliament?
You're asking a member of the House of Lords to advise the Speaker of the House of Commons.
Well, only generally. You can give friendly advice. You don't have to be unfriendly about it.
I very much doubt that he would ask for my advice. Even further doubt that he would accept it. And I don't think it's for me to give it to him.
Thank you very much for him for coming in. Now, we can return to number 10 because, of course, we saw Arlene Foster, the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, walking up that famous street into number 10. Those discussions are obviously still going on. Norman, what can you tell us? You keep looking over your shoulder just in case she comes out that door. What can you tell us so far?
Actually, I was looking, I don't know if you can see, a much more interesting fight about to erupt, it seems, between Palmerston and Larry, who's lying flat on his back in the street. Now, that is a serious clash which could be just about to unfold. I don't know whether I should intervene, actually. It's...
Yes,
boy, Palmerston.
No, right, hang on. Is he actually making ground on... I don't know which one's... Is it Larry lying there, did you say?
Larry is lying asleep.
Yes.
And I have to say, Palmerston parked himself in front of number 10 a short time ago, and I thought, Palmerston, you are chancing your arm there. I think Larry's woken up now.
Oh,
He's woken up. He's realised there's trouble.
Has a fight been averted? Is this a euphemism for what's going on behind the black door?
Well, I don't know. Arlene Foster arrived a short time ago, and we duly shouted at her about, is there going to be a deal? She said absolutely nothing. But I guess the expectation is there will be some sort of agreement, even if it's only the headlines of an agreement, because, let's be honest, there's a mutual vested interest for both parties to reach some sort of accommodation. They're both pro-Brexit. They're both virulently anti-Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. For Mrs May, she absolutely needs a deal to get that Commons majority so she can govern. And for the DUP, well, they will hope they will get money, that there will be cash for economic regeneration and reconstruction. So there is a huge sort of mutual self-interest in reaching a bargain. So I suspect, it'll all be handshake, smiles and photo opportunities today. I think the trouble is more down the line as to whether this sort of arrangement can actually stick and last in the longer term.
I mean, in the short term, we're still waiting, aren't we, for a date for the Queen's speech, for the legislative programme to be presented to Parliament. And presumably, once these talks are over, Norman, and if an arrangement has been reached by the two ladies, then we will find out when that Queen's speech is going to be.
Well, perhaps there is one scenario where the DUP just decide to play hardball. And they say, you know what, that's very interesting, Mrs May. Yes, this is all good stuff, and I'm sure we can reach an agreement, but, we just got to go away and finesse a few things. In other words, they don't sign on the dotted line today, but to sort of increase their leverage, they basically keep Mrs May waiting, in which case the Prime Minister cannot say to the Queen, you're OK, next Monday, we're on for the Queen's speech. So, it depends whether the DUP are ready to actually sign on the dotted line today, or they choose to keep Mrs May waiting a bit longer, in which case we really do not know when the Queen's speech is going to be.
Well, Norman, thank you very much, and keep Palmerston and Larry apart, and keep your eye on that black door.
Now,
They're having a face-off. Well, I will leave you to concentrate on number 10. Thank you very much, Norman Smith. Well, here we go again, something different. For the fourth time in 12 months, UKIP is picking a new leader. Their previous leader, Paul Nuttall, resigned after the party failed to win a seat in the general election. We're speaking to all the candidates on Daily Politics. First, though, is David Coburn, who joins us from Strasbourg. We haven't got very long with you, David Coburn, but thank you for joining us. You say you're running for UKIP leader to stop entryists, dilettantes and single-issue loonies. What do you mean by that?
Well, what I am doing is I'm hoping that Nigel's going to stand. My hope is that Nigel Farage is going to be our leader again. I think he's the best man for the job. But if he doesn't stand, then I will have to stand to make sure we don't have people coming in who are just not got the right idea. We want to go back to good old-fashioned UKIP, which is, Nigel had working beautifully, and we want to have that again, not this nonsense.
Well, at the risk of sounding like Brenda during the general election campaign, Nigel, again?
Yes. Well, I regret that he ever left in the first place, quite frankly, but I'm hoping that he will stand. But if he doesn't, then I will be standing. I want to make sure that we offer what we've always offered, which is that the ordinary working guy and girl, give them a good run for their money, make sure they get treated fairly, keep taxes low, make sure that we get Brexit. We've seen what's happened with the Conservative Party. It's disintegrating, and this ridiculous election they've had has resulted in disaster.
Right.
So obviously we've got to be there to make sure things go through.
Theresa May, of course, is still there.
Already having,
well, just very briefly, before we have to let you go, David, was Paul Nuttall right to resign?
Yes, I think he did the right thing. I think he was ill-advised by the people around him, but I think he was right to resign. I think we need to move on. We've got serious problems now in Scotland. You've got people worrying about Ruth Davidson. She promised Brexit, and now she's reneging on it. She's
OK, we'll have to leave it there. I'm sorry to cut you short. All right, I'm sorry to cut you short, but thank you very much for joining us briefly, David Coburn in Strasbourg. Now, there's just time before we go to find out the answer to our quiz. The question was, which of these is the odd one out? Michael Howard, Will Barton as Boris Johnson, B. Jacqueline King as Theresa May, C. Meryl Streep as Margaret Thatcher, or D. John Seward as Michael Gove? What is the odd one out? Quickly.
Michael Gove?
No, it's not Michael Gove. It's Meryl Streep as Margaret Thatcher. You didn't know that's because she was in a film and the others are a docudrama. I think that's the answer anyway. I hope so. That's it for today. Thanks to all our guests, particularly to you for being our guest of the day. And the 1 o'clock news is starting over on BBC One now from all of us here. Bye-bye.